Hello, I'm Robert, volunteer fact checker and helping you if you're scared of many things. And this is about Trump's secondary sanctions on Russian fossil fuel and uranium exports. And if these work, they're a way to a possible peace in Ukraine. If they don't work, all that happens is that the war continues, just like Trump's other peace attempts. So up to the present, Trump has been trying everything he can to make it easier for Putin to agree to peace. And Putin is just not interested. He hasn't even responded to very limited ceasefires. He's not interested in any form of ceasefire, not interested in stopping the war at all. When they do have peace negotiations, he typically ramps up and fires lots more drones at Ukrainian cities as a kind of way of signalling that he's just not interested. So if an invader won't negotiate peace, then what do? Well, you have to stop the invasion in some other way. And that's the only way that could just possibly lead to Putin considering a peace deal. So how can we stop it? And so Russia has hardly moved for nearly 3 years and loses over 1,000 soldiers a day. So most invaders would be negotiating peace long ago. They'd have negotiated peace probably over 2 years ago. But not for Putin, so that's not going to work for him. And I'll talk later in later parts of, probably in later videos, about why, trying to figure out why that is, why Putin isn't interested in stopping a war that is achieving so little. But that's just the reality we're in. So then any NATO country that could win this war very quickly. So NATO has got vastly superior air power with its F-35s. And any NATO country could take over the airspace above occupied Ukraine and the borders of Russia, and indeed further afield if they wanted to, but they wouldn't be interested in that. And the war would be over pretty quickly. It would just destroy all the air defences from the sky and be very much like the way that Israel took over the airspace of Iran. That is how much better the NATO Air Force is than the Russian Air Force, and I think everyone agrees on that, amongst the experts. So any NATO country could win this war very quickly. Russia would probably retreat after the first day of that, or negotiate for peace. But Ukraine allies are not considering giving anything like that level of capability to Ukraine. So, and they're not going to intervene themselves. So that's not a way to end the war. So then there are various ways that Ukraine could develop its own capabilities, and these may be possible over periods of weeks to months. And also ways that Russia might get weaker, and that also could happen over timescales of months rather than weeks. Possibly by the end of this year, maybe early next year, it might get so weak because of its lack of Soviet-era gear. So those are ways that it might end eventually. But how can we end it more quickly than that? So that's, you look at the cost of the war. And the modern wars are very, very expensive and very difficult to keep going. And so what Trump plans to do is to use tariffs to try to get India, China and other countries to stop buying Russian fossil fuels. Because that's how he's paying for this oil, this war, this very expensive war. And then if that succeeds, then Putin may decide that it's no longer worth doing because it's too expensive, and then stop fighting. So that's basically the idea. So now let's go and look at this tackling the cost of war in more detail. So Russia earns over $500 million a day from the sale of fossil fuels, and that goes directly to the government. The war costs Russia over $220 million a day. It's roughly half the amount it's earning from fossil fuels, compared to its defence budget before the war. And even if you include the defence budget before the war, the fossil fuels pay for that as well. It's much less than that 220 million. So Russia is paying for this war with its revenue of the sales of oil, and much of it is to India and China. Indeed, if you could stop the sales of oil to India and China, that's roughly equivalent to the cost of the war. And he just can't, modern soldiers can't fight without the funding that they need for their shells, drones, vehicles, and it's not just their wages, but all these things as well. Very expensive to maintain and supply and keep running, and the oil, fuel for them, and so on. So that's why secondary tariffs are a possible way of stopping the war. And then as for Trump, he's just going to put 100% tariffs. Secondary tariffs, he's already put 100% tariffs on China before, more than 100%. So he just do the very similar thing, but this time for a different objective. And he say to them, look, I put these tariffs on you, now let's negotiate. What are you willing to do? We want you to stop buying Russian fossil fuels. And then they'll start negotiating back, and India will say, we really, really need uranium from Russia. Let's have an exemption from that. And you must give us some sort of incentive to do this, because we're getting the oil very low price from Russia. So what can you give us as a reason to start buying from you again, and from the Arabic and the UAE and other parts of the world? And so this is something that everyone agrees that, I think just about everyone, even people who are very opposed to Trump, agree that he is good at deal making. Often people question the reason for his deals. It sometimes seems very bizarre. But once he's decided he wants to make a particular deal, he is very good at making that deal if it's a practical, possible thing to do. He hasn't been able to make a deal with Putin for the simple reason that nobody could make a deal with Putin. So it's not really a lapse in his deal making, it's just he was trying the impossible, because Putin had already decided in advance, we can be pretty certain of that he decided before Trump was elected probably that he's never going to agree. That's the way Putin does things, but then he pretends to be sincere. So that's very probably what he did. So, but Trump didn't know that. Other people can't know that because they can't know his mind. So, so what's going to happen if they stop buying Russian fossil fuels? Then Putin will have to decide. And the aim is not to destroy the Russian economy. And their fossil fuel industry will continue. It's a very big country, 150 million Russians. They'll be selling oil and coal and gas to each other. So it's not destroying the fossil fuel industry, but it's destroying the income to the industry from the rest of the world. And most of that income goes straight to the US, to the Russian government. So without that income, what does Putin do? So he can do an income tax. And if I got my calculation right, then it'd be about 8.7% income tax per Russian worker, which is quite a lot, but not impossible. Or he can just accept Trump's peace offer and negotiate a ceasefire. And the issue is that ordinary Russians, they don't know why they're fighting. Ukrainians are very clear about that. They're paying 5% of the income tax to try to stop Putin advancing in Ukraine, because they know very well what will happen. That anyone who's opposed to Putin would be put in prison, and probably including most people who've been fighting in the war. That and the leaders of the government and so on. The Russians would take the Ukrainian children away from their parents and forcefully adopt them into Russian families. The Ukrainians would be prohibited from singing their national anthem. They would be prohibited from doing anything that's ethnically Ukrainian, and their culture would be destroyed, eliminated. This has happened in occupied Ukraine, and this is sure to happen if Putin takes over the rest of Ukraine. So of course they don't want that, and so they're willing to pay 5% income tax to prevent that. But now if you look at the Russians, Ukrainians are not going to force Russians to sing the Ukrainian national anthem. They're not going to forcefully adopt Russian children into Ukrainian homes. They're not going to even take any Russian land. That's not their objective. They only took Kursk to protect themselves. A little bit of Kursk Oblast to protect themselves. So why would the Russian people pay 8.7% income tax to fund the war? What's the incentive for them? And there isn't any really. So that's why Putin, and I know Putin is a dictator, and he can just say, look, I'm going to tax you anyway, no matter what you think. But Putin is very sensitive to the ordinary Russian people, and he does endless polls to try and see what they make of what he's doing, even though he's not elected in fair elections. But he knows that that a dictator can only really govern their country, even if it's a dictatorship, if the ordinary people are behind him to a certain extent, and they see it's worth their while to follow him. And so he is very reluctant to put an income tax on the ordinary Russians. So they're not very clear why they're fighting, and Putin, it's not at all clear why Putin is fighting. So I said it makes no military sense. He gave up Russia's presence in the Middle East and the whole of Syria, a very large country, and the Tartus port, and an airfield near the Tartus port, which is the only seaport that Russia has outside the former Soviet Union. He gave all that up in December, and what was his objective in Ukraine? That he couldn't spare even a few thousand soldiers and a few fighter jets to stop Assad's, to protect Assad's regime from rebels in open top trucks. And why couldn't he help Assad? It's because he had to keep advancing another field, another hamlet in Pokrovsk. And that was his main objective there in eastern Ukraine, in the Donbass region. Just to gain a few houses, a few hamlets. Then he gave up all of Syria and the Tartus port, and the Russians were free to travel pretty much anywhere in Syria, but they can't go into Syria at all now. They're just not permitted to go in. So he gave up freedom of access to all of Syria and to the Mediterranean, to get the ships to be able to dock in the Mediterranean, and planes to be able to land in the Mediterranean. Gave all that up in order to advance in Pokrovsk. So that's why I say, if he was working on a military basis, he wouldn't do this. He gave up Russian presence in Azerbaijan as well, for the same reason. And he's given up so many things all around the world, just in order to keep fighting in Ukraine. So it's not going. What's going to change this if there's a shift in the internal politics in Russia and in the Kremlin? Because it's not military based at all. Why he keeps fighting in Ukraine? Not in the way that an ordinary military commander would think in terms of commanding their military. So, and as I say, Europe has realised that his promises are useless, and Trump's only realised it recently. So he has to be, and giving in to his demands just leads to him demanding more. And that's what Trump has found. He's tried to negotiate with Putin. He's given him lots of things that he demanded, and Putin just demands more, and never makes even one step forward in offering anything back from his side. And that's how negotiations work with Putin. He only listens to people who are stronger than him. And so this is why the sanctions have a possibility of bringing about peace. So this is Putin's decision tree. Trump gives Putin a week and a half to choose peace. So Putin chooses peace, hooray. That's extremely unlikely to happen. So Putin keeps fighting. Or his army does. So Trump then threatens India and China with secondary tariffs unless they stop buying Russian oil. He'll probably just slap on 100% tariffs on China and say, look, you've got to stop buying Russian oil, and then I'll remove it. We'll see how he does it. And the same with India and some other countries. So what happens? Either they just completely refuse, and it just doesn't work, and eventually Trump is forced to back down, or they say, well, this is a very minor hassle, they just stop buying Russian oil, and so they stop buying the oil. So then, if they do stop buying the oil, if they don't stop, then this has no effect. If they do stop buying oil, then Putin's army gradually runs out of money to fight, and Putin needs $250 million a day, just short of. So what does Putin do? When he runs out of money, he might choose peace. then hooray, it's worked. The sanctions have worked. Or he might say, well, look, I'm going to impose these sanctions on Russian people, and whatever it is, this is my figure. I hope I've got it right now. It's quite tricky to calculate, and I can't find anyone else giving me an actual figure for the amount of the taxes, but it's to give you a rough idea of what they are, of the amount of money that Putin needs to raise. And so he raised the taxes, and then he eventually, with some reluctance, the Russian people keep going, and they keep fighting. And then maybe he runs out of Soviet gear, then that leads to peace. Or Ukraine gets new capabilities or levers, so Ukraine's abilities are greatly increasing. They're much greater now than they were a year ago, and they'll be much greater again by the end of the summer. And whereas Russia's capabilities are not increasing in the same way at all, they're pretty much steady. So Ukraine gets new capabilities or levers, and then Putin chooses peace. Or Ukraine's allies find another way to persuade Putin to stop the war, and then he chooses peace. So it's always, the only things are, the war continues, or Putin chooses peace. And then I think just do a little bit more for the next couple of sections. So I just want to say Putin hasn't responded, and it's utterly normal. So Putin bluffs when something can achieve with his bluffs, but in this case, Peskov, his spokesperson, all that this we have got from Russia so far is, I would like to avoid any assessments. We have taken note of President Trump's statements he made yesterday, and he says the special military operation is continuing, and we remain committed to a peace process for settling the conflict and securing our interests. In other words, the usual words saying we are committed to peace, but we're going to keep fighting, which is what Russia always says. And their commitment to peace turns out to have all sorts of impossible conditions associated with it, but they keep saying we're committed to peace, but we have to keep fighting, and that's what they've been doing all the way through. And I want to upload this quite soon, but let's just see what else can I do. I'll make this just going to explain. Let's just explain why India and China are likely to comply with the request. So this is India, and so the whole point is the United States has much higher leverage than Russia. Russia is between Saudi Arabia and United Arab Emirates in the total trade with India. The United States is way higher. It's about double what Russia trades, and it's also got the European Union is closely associated with the United States as well. And you combine those together, it's 4 times what Russia trades. So the United States has far more leverage over India than Russia has. And remember, this is only about a small part of the Russian trade, just the oil and the fossil fuels and possibly uranium. And the United States is trying to use leverage to get India to stop that small part of the Russian trade. So that's India. Now we look at China, then Russia's even much smaller. It's between Australia and Vietnam, and it's far less than half the United States, and the European Union is more even the United States. Those two combined, then they're many times the total trade of Russia. So, and remember, the sanctions only for these energy exports of oil, gas, uranium, other fossil fuels, some coal. And now, if we go and look, I explained in the introduction that China and India, they are the top importers of oil. Very likely that Trump does not tariff any country that is actually helping Ukraine in the war. That was the idea of the senators, and it's very likely that Trump does the same. He says, look, if you're helping Ukraine, then we're not bothered about you buying Russian oil and gas, because that will only leave a very small percentage of all the gas and oil left. So now we go and look at the Russian fossil fuel revenue. And it was originally $1 billion, and the various measures have brought it down to a bit over $500 million a day that Russia is earning from it. And this is about why they would work for India. So India is only buying the oil since the war started because it's so very cheap. because Russia is just forced to sell its oil at rock bottom prices, to sell it at all to anyone. So India used to buy, Iraq used to be its top source of oil, and Russia was the bottom at 2%. And India has turned that around, and it's now 41% Russia, and it's only 20%, 11%, 4%. They've all gone down a bit. So all Putin is saying is, we want to turn this. Trump is saying is, he wants to turn that around and say to India, you just stop buying all that stuff from Russia and increase these numbers to get up to the amount of oil you need. It costs a bit more, but so that's where the negotiating comes in. That because it's, even though it's that top importer, and it's twice the amount that Iraq it gets from Iraq, it's less than half the price because the oil is so much less cost from Russia. So that's why India does it. And so the United States has to either put a lot of pressure on India or sweeten the deal in some way, to encourage India. But that's only a small fraction of the total export and import costs to India of everything that imports and exports. It's not such huge figures for a country as big as India. And then with China, the increase was somewhat more slow, 15%, 70%, 18.6%. But so it's maybe somewhat more difficult to persuade India, but then China is much less dependent. It's got a much more diversified portfolio, and it's much less dependent on the Russian oil and gas, and it's a very low part of their total portfolio. So he's got a chance of persuading China, or he might say to China, okay, you buy, I know you buy gas from Russia at rock bottom prices, they make hardly any profit on that, so let's exempt you the gas, but stop buying the Russian oil, or something like that. So they wouldn't end the war, as I said, and this is my calculation. Sorry, that should be 8.3%. This is my calculation. So the budget was 65.91 billion in 2021, 149 billion in 2024. The difference is 227 million a day, 83 billion, and that's the amount extra that Russia is spending because of the war. And then I work out the population of number of workers and divide that by the number of workers to get $95 a month. The weekly salary is 1,100, and then you get the percentage, works out 8.7%. It's the tax that Putin would have to work out, if I got those numbers correct. And that's the Ukrainian 5%. So that's how it's done. So yeah, I'll end here and with this section, and I'll talk in more detail in the second half of this video. So why they should stop the war? If Trump can get India especially to stop buying Russian oil, then it removes up to $500 million a day from Russia's government. Well, it could cost about 2 to 7 to have to fix that. That wouldn't have an immediate impact. So then you have to find another way to fund the war. You've got income tax of 8.7%, would be one way to do it. But Putin does care about what the Russians think. He's careful, risk-averse, pragmatic. He always has reasons for what he does, though the objectives make little sense, such as to people outside Russia, like why he gave up Syria and the Tartars port in order to advance slowly in Donbass. But he has reasons which make sense to himself, and he's within that way of reasoning, which is very parochial to the Kremlin and Russia. Then he is extremely risk-averse, very pragmatic, very slow to act, and he thinks about things for typically weeks to months before he does anything. So with that background, Russia would never conclude, I know how to solve it, let's fight NATO as well. Can you see how that wouldn't work? Because if Russia didn't even want to fight Syrian rebels in open trucks with the soldiers fighting in the back and firing their guns from open trucks, and this was just taking too much expense from the war in Ukraine, and too many people, even if it's just a few thousand. So he just didn't see the need to protect the Assad regime, which was giving Russia free access to Syria and the Middle East. So he's never going to conclude, I know how to solve it, let's fight NATO as well. That'd be vastly more expensive. If he can't pay for the war in Ukraine, then he certainly can't pay to start fighting NATO. So that wouldn't save any money. It wouldn't get any new buyers for his oil. It would achieve nothing. And the only thing that would do indeed is that NATO countries would say, well, look, Russia's fighting us anyway, so give Ukraine everything it needs. Let's give it the F-35s. Let's give it the Tomahawks. Why not? Because they're fighting with us, and NATO is on the other side. So there's no way that makes any sense whatsoever, given that Putin's objective is to advance slowly in Ukraine. And that's what all this is about. And everything else is just peripheral to that. And this wouldn't work. It just wouldn't help Putin to achieve that objective of very slowly advancing in Ukraine, which is his main focus at the moment. He will give up almost anything in order to advance a few kilometers in Ukraine. So there's no way he's going to attack NATO. It's not going to achieve that objective at all. So at some point he may then just decide it's not worth doing. And at that point, it's pretty easy for him to end the war. Remember, he gave up Tartarsport in Syria, his airbase there, and for most countries that would be seen as a huge failure of their leader. But Putin just told his people he had achieved everything he set out to achieve in Syria. And that's it. He's got control of state propaganda. If anyone thought that was a bit odd, they just don't get heard on television. And they don't get written about. And so he could just end the war in Ukraine and say he's achieved everything he set out to achieve in Ukraine. And few Russians will question him. They'll say, well, hooray for our leader, he's done what he said he'd do. He's achieved everything. He told us that he's achieved everything, so he has achieved everything. That's how they'd respond. And then that would be the end of the war. So I think that's enough for this. I'll upload this now. I'll talk a bit more in the next video, going into some more detail about these points and why there's nothing here to be scared of at all.